Well, how y'all doing this morning? Everybody doing good? All right, this beautiful Chicago summer weather that we're having out there, and I am from Chicago, so I can say that. This is about what it's like in July up there, so move on up there. You'll love it. Trust me. Well, my name is Eric Cohen. It's my joy and privilege. Karen and I are here with you this morning. If you'd open up your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2, that's where we'll be parking today. And have you ever noticed that there's certain times in life where the direction you're looking determines the direction that you will go? Just think about that for a minute. The direction you're looking will determine the direction that you'll go. I found this to be especially true when I learned to ride a motorcycle. And I learned two things when I was learning to ride a motorcycle. The first was that there are motorcycles and then there are Harley Davidsons. So I'm on the side of the equation with Harley Davidson. But then I also learned that it's very important when you're riding your motorcycle to look where you want the bike to go. Because if you look another direction, even if it seems that you have the handlebars, it seems like you have them pointed straight ahead. If you're looking off to the right, guess what the bike wants to do? It wants to start veering over to the right a little bit. And I found that this was especially important when you're turning a corner. So here's how it works. If you're turning the corner on your bike, your natural inclination is, let's say I'm turning right, is to want to look down to the right to make sure I'm not going to hit the curb. But here's the problem. If I look down, guess what the bike wants to do? It wants to go down and I tip my Harley. Or if I'm turning right and I see a pretty bird over in that parking lot over there, and so while I'm turning, I'm looking over at that pretty bird and saying, oh, look at the bird. My Harley doesn't want to turn, it sort of wants to go wide, and I risk tipping my Harley by hitting an oncoming car maybe. And so I found out when I'm riding my motorcycle, no matter how counterintuitive it is, no matter how much I want to do something different, it's important for me to look where I want to go. Otherwise, I tip my Harley. And it's the same way in our spiritual lives. I found, and I'm sure you found it too, that often, if we don't keep our eyes on God, we tip our spiritual Harleys. Because our lives start going in directions we don't want them to go. In fact, here's the premise I'd like us to consider today. Here's what I think God would like to say to us this morning. In order to change the trajectory of our lives, we must change the direction of our gaze. So if we don't like the way our lives are going, if our lives aren't going the way we think Jesus would have them go, and we want to change that trajectory, the direction our lives are going, we need to change the direction of our gaze, and that direction should be to get our eyes back on Jesus. And if you're open to Exodus chapter 2, we're actually going to talk about a guy who came just after Joseph, which I understand who you've been talking about in your messages. That's really cool. We're going to talk about Moses, and Moses, we're going to discover, tipped his spiritual Harley in a pretty major way because he got his eyes off of God. And so remember what we're saying here today. In order to change the trajectory of our lives, we must change the direction of our gaze. So let's take a look at the life of Moses. And the first thing in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, I think we should notice, not only from Moses' life, but our life, is that when we first enter into a relationship with God, when we place our faith in Jesus and trust in Him alone for salvation, most of us begin that journey looking up or looking toward God because we have to. It's a supernatural deal, and it was a supernatural deal for Moses. So, little history lesson here. I think, have you all been talking about Joseph? So you know who Joseph was, and eventually, if you haven't gotten there yet, you'll get to the part of the story where Joseph, through no fault of his own, lands in Egypt on a long vacation. And he gets to visit some very scenic places like the prison system. You'll probably get there. And eventually, through what some people would say are circumstances, but through what we know to be God's providence, Joseph ends up being the prime minister of Egypt. And through the blessing of God on his life, he ends up feeding not only the people of Egypt during 7 years of famine, but the whole surrounding area. The whole surrounding area. And then finally, Joseph dies. And at the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says that the Pharaoh that knew Joseph passed away, and the new Pharaoh got worried. And he got worried because God started to fulfill his promise to the children of Israel, and they started to multiply. In fact, it's sort of a funny story. If you go back and read Exodus 1, it says that the more Pharaoh tried to stamp them out, the more they multiplied. You ever try to kill cockroaches? You spray them, and it seems like the next morning there's more than when you started. Well, that's the picture we get here of the children of Israel. God's blessing, God's promise was being fulfilled so supernaturally that there's starting to be a larger and larger and larger population of Jewish people living on Pharaoh's southern border. And Pharaoh got concerned. Because when you have a large foreign nation living on one of your borders, maybe one day they might rebel. And so Pharaoh started a process to control that population. And he started out by making their work real hard, taking away TV, all that kind of stuff, and they just kept multiplying. And finally it culminates in one of the most terrible things I think any of us can imagine, genocide, where the Pharaoh of Egypt issued an order that the firstborn of Israel should be killed. In fact, it got to the point where any Egyptian could walk up to a Jewish woman carrying a baby and take that baby from them and throw it in the river and drown it. And that was the environment into which Moses was born. And we see that in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months." So, babies are small, unless you have a large one, when they're born. And so he was so small that they could hide him. But what happens to babies over time? It happens to all of us. We get bigger. And so after 3 months, his mom started saying, I can't hide this child. For one thing, he's getting bigger, and now he's starting to, wiggle around and not wanting to be confined. And so she had to come up with an alternate plan. And it starts to get more and more supernatural. So catch this. So when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. In other words, she took this weed basket, what we might say like a wicker basket, and she got some tar off the highway system, and she painted this thing with a brush and coated it with tar, let it harden, and then she placed Moses in it. And the text tells us that she let this basket float away in the reeds along the Nile River. Now think about that for a minute. What else is in the Nile River in the reeds? Crocodiles. So basically, this is a supernatural thing. She entrusts Moses to the providence of God and releases this little baby in a basket into a river where it could be tipped, where a crocodile could take it, and lets it float away. And then the text tells us that she also sends his older sister, who was a child, to follow along in the reeds to make sure everything's okay. So now you've got 2 of your children in the Nile River, in the reeds with the crocodiles, hoping that something good will happen for this child. It's supernatural. You can't help but look up. And now, what happens next is even more amazing. It says, it just so happens that on this very day, the daughter of Pharaoh came down with all her female servants to take a bath in the Nile River. And it just so happens at that exact moment, it just a consequence, just a chance that a basket painted in tar floats by. And maybe as it's floating by, she sees this little hand maybe come up. Somehow, someone get me out of here. And so it says, she sent one of her servants over, and it says the baby was crying. Just so happened to cry at that exact moment. And so Pharaoh's daughter, who was understanding orders from her father, if she saw a young baby, to do what? Throw it in the Nile River. It says she took pity on him. And so she adopts the baby as her own. And here, she needs a midwife. She needs somebody to nurse it. Who does she get? Moses' mother. Just happens to be available. And so it's supernatural. And I love how it ends. I love how this part of the story ends. It's in verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10, it says, when Moses, the child, grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, the midwife did, and he became her what? Son. He became her son. And so she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. That's a either there are a ton of really neat consequences or coincidences, or that's a supernatural story. You have to look up. That's a picture of salvation. That's a picture of our salvation. All of us begin our relationship with God by looking up. Have you ever considered how weird our salvation is and how unlikely it is? First of all, if I'm God, and I'm nowhere near that, but if I were, my plan would not have been to send my son into Bethlehem, into a place where animals feed, to be born. That just would not have been part of my plan. That's supernatural. It would not have been part of my plan to have him grow up in a town that had just a terrible reputation, Nazareth. Sort of the size of Taylor. I'm trying to think of a good comparison today of what it would be like to have the Messiah come from Nazareth. Maybe if he was an Aggie. That would have been, maybe not. You have to pick your flavor, but maybe. It's unlikely. How likely is it that our Messiah would be killed by a Roman execution that only criminals were killed by? Crucifixion, which was terrible. It was awful. It was basically a public service announcement that said, don't do what this guy did, or this will happen to you. It was shameful. It was disgusting. It was embarrassing. And yet that's how our salvation was accomplished. It can't help but force you to look up. And I'm sure if we all sat in a room here today and shared our stories about how we came to know Jesus, they would all be really unlikely. They would be super unlikely. We had to look up. And so we begin our lives with God looking in the right direction. We begin by looking up. But then, if you're like me, life happens, right? So you're looking up, you come into a relationship with Jesus, you're riding your spiritual Harley, you're zooming along, and all of a sudden there's a bird in the parking lot. You go, oh. Or maybe something bad's happening around you. And your Harley maybe slowly, maybe imperceptibly, starts to veer just a little off course. And maybe your life starts to go in a direction that you didn't want it to go. And that's what happens to Moses. Take a look. Verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. So Moses, now remember, who is Moses now? He is a prince of Egypt. That means he's got power. That means he's got all the good stuff. That means he doesn't have to worry about anything. He's part of the ruling system. And it says one day he went out to his people, that being the Jewish people, the Hebrews. And he looked on their burdens. So evidently it seems like this is the first time he was so sheltered that this is the first time he's actually seen what his own people are going through. He sees their suffering. He sees the burdens that Pharaoh has laid on them. He sees children being killed for no other reason that they were born Jewish. And he looks on this, and he saw, now catch what he sees. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So Moses walks out one day, sees all this suffering, and then looks and happens to see an Egyptian guy beating up a Hebrew guy. Now, if I'm a prince of Egypt and if I see an Egyptian doing something to a Hebrew guy, and I don't like what I see, there's probably some really good options on what I could do to stop that. Being a prince of Egypt and having all kinds of authority, and Pharaoh being my grandpa. There's probably some things I could do. But Moses does something that I don't think any of us would probably have thought of, even in our best moments. Now catch this. It says in verse 12, Moses looked this way and that. So here's the picture. Moses walks out, sees what's going on, then he does one of these. And have you ever seen somebody do this? That means one of two things. They're crossing the street, or they're afraid someone may see what they're about to do. I love the picture here. Moses looks this way, and then he looks this, but you notice he never looks that way. And he comes up with a really great plan. This is what he does. He kills the Egyptian. All the things he could have done to correct the situation, he kills the Egyptian, and then, in just an utter moment of brilliance, hides the dead body in sand. How many of you have ever buried something in sand? It doesn't stay there real long. You know, and I think about my life and times where I've tried to manage my situation. When I'm doing one of these, you know, I'm seeing all kinds of circumstances around me that look maybe scary. Maybe I don't like my circumstances. Maybe I think something bad's about to happen. Maybe I think something needs to be fixed. When I don't look up, when I start doing this, well, let me just say this. If you're like me, and maybe you found this out as well, whenever I get myself into messes, and I've done it quite a bit in my life, I make Moses look like Einstein on some of these plans that I'm able to come up with. Have you discovered that when you get yourself into trouble, they all have one thing in common? All of them. This is what I've discovered. I was there. All the times I got myself into trouble, I was there. And I'm the one that sort of thought it up. And that's what Moses does. He looks right, he looks left, and he thinks up this plan. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, he's thinking, man, I just did a really good thing. I defended one of my own people. In fact, I am sure that one day, in fact, maybe tomorrow, these people will thank me for what I've done. And I've hidden the body, nobody saw, and this is going to be great. But as often happens, when we tip our Harleys, things don't always turn out the way we think they're going to. Take a look at verses 13 through 15. It says, now, when he went out the next day, Moses goes out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were now fighting with each other. So now it's a fight between two of his own people. Yesterday it was an Egyptian and a Hebrew guy. Now it's two Hebrews. And Moses said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? In other words, you know, I fixed this yesterday, I'll fix it today. And Moses is probably thinking, they'll listen to me, they're going to respect me, I stuck up for them, of course they would listen to me. And this is what the man says. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? In other words, who do you think you are? And then he asks a follow-up question. Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Someone saw. Someone knows. The word has gotten around. And now look what happens. And Moses was afraid and thought, somebody saw me. The gig's up. And when Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh into the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well in the middle of a desert. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, how often, when we get our eyes off of God and we start looking to the right and to the left at our circumstances, we end up, God sometimes sends us into what I call the spiritual desert. God calls, St. John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul. And if you think about what's in a desert to see, well, you've got sand, you may have some cactuses, some bushes, and we know that Moses had sheep. Have you ever noticed that a lot of times when God takes us to a place, he takes us where there's not a lot to look at, especially when he wants to get our eyes back on him. And it's not to punish us. It's to get our eyes from looking all around to now being able to focus on him again. All Moses had was sand and cactuses and sheep. And by the way, how many of you have ever hung out around sheep? Any of you ever done? I recommend that today after church. If you've never done that, go find some sheep and hang around them. It's not the romantic notion. In fact, being a shepherd was not number one on the career choice list at this time in history. Being a shepherd was like probably the lowest. No one wanted to be a shepherd unless they had to, because sheep are just nasty creatures. They're stubborn. They will do what they want to do when they want to do it. And if they don't like what you're telling them, guess what they'll do? They will turn around and bite you. Any of you ever been bitten by a sheep? That's why shepherds carry sticks with a hook at the end, so they can sometimes protect the sheep, but most of the time protect themselves from the sheep and get them to go where they want them to go. Seems like God may have been preparing Moses for something. All Moses has to look at is the sheep. All Moses has to look at is sand. And it probably seemed to Moses in the 40 years that he spent in the desert that this was all there would ever be. He probably felt like, remember, he was a prince of Egypt, and now he's a shepherd in the desert. I bet you there were times where he thought his life was over. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like circumstances will just never change? That I've made some bad decisions and I've gotten my eyes off God and my Harley's been dumped and now this is all I will ever have? I guarantee you Moses felt that way. Now, what's beautiful is let's jump down to verses 23 through 25, because here's something I want us to catch. It says, during those many days, 40 years, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, died. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel. And I love how it ends here. And it says, and God knew. Here's the deal. Moses didn't know any of this. All Moses could see was sand and sheep and cactuses. He didn't know that Pharaoh had died. He didn't know that the people of Israel were now crying out to God and that God had heard their voice and was now on the move to deliver them. Moses didn't know any of that because all he could see was what was right in front of him. Sand and cactuses and sheep. I don't care where you are in life. I don't care what's happened. God is on the move. God is working. even when it seems like all you can see are your own sand and cactuses and sheep. And God is like that parent who wants to get the attention of their child, who reaches down as the child is doing this and gently grabs their face and pulls it up to his own. Says, look at me. You can't see everything that I see. And that's our last point today. Moses discovered it, and we will discover it here, is that when we're in our desert, when we're in that dark night of the soul, God gently reaches down and grabs our face so that we will change the direction of our gaze from our circumstances back to Him. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." And I'm sure this is something that Moses did thousands of times during that 40-year period. He led the sheep out to the west side and stood before God's mountain, and he saw the same thing that he always saw, except the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of a fire out of the midst of a bush. Now, bushes were nothing unusual. There were lots of bushes in the desert. In fact, it wasn't even unusual that one of the bushes may be on fire. Things catch on fire in the desert. Sometimes lightning will strike them, they'll burn. Sometimes nomadic tribes will start fires and leave them go, and things will burn. And so that wasn't unusual. It was still the same old, except for one small difference. Catch this. And behold, and whenever you see that word behold, they're trying to get your attention. Behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not what? Consumed. The bush was burning, and it was not consumed. Now that's unusual. Do you see how God got Moses' attention? He did something unusual in the midst of the usual. Have you ever been in a classroom when you were a kiddo and the teacher was talking and could not get the kids' attention? Sometimes they yelled, and that wasn't always real effective because it seems like the kids could match volume. And so often what good teachers would do is they would start whispering. And people assume that if you're whispering, it must be important. And so God often whispers. He often whispers to us in the midst of our ordinary stuff, and that focuses us to do what? Listen carefully. Because we're so prone to looking this way and that way, God has to train us to focus on Him and to listen carefully. So what does that look like? Well, maybe it's an unexpected promotion or demotion at work that comes out of nowhere. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Maybe it's a change in a relationship. Maybe you start hearing the same thing over and over and over again from different people in different situations telling you the same thing. These are ways that God whispers to us in the midst of the ordinary. I had sort of an odd track into ministry. After the military, I did 6 years in the military because I didn't want to do 7. And after the military, I went to college and then seminary and then youth ministry for 5, 6, 7 years. And then my parents got sick. We really weren't sure what the next step was. So I stepped into the corporate world for a period of 10 years. Did the IT thing back in the 90s when it was hot. And so I thought that's where I'd stay the rest of my life because, let's be honest, IT professionals make a little more than youth pastors. So that was good. And I was good at it. I enjoyed it. And life was just good. We had a nice life, and it wasn't any great sin. But if I have to be honest, my eyes are doing more of this thing than they were this, because I just sort of got used to life. And it was sort of funny, after about 10 years of that, and again, totally happy, not thinking about making any changes, I started to get some weird things started to happen. Like I'd get a friend just call me out of nowhere and say, have you ever thought about going back into ministry? No, really haven't. Guy that discipled me 15 years before that say, hey, Eric, I was in the car the other day listening to one of your tapes and you preached at our church. Have you ever thought about going back into ministry? I'd read a quiet time. I'd have a quiet time and it'd be something about ministry. I'd watch a movie and it was about a pastor. And then one day, Karen and I are going in the front door of our church for a normal service, just like every other day, every other Sunday. And the senior pastor says to me, hey, my associate pastor just decided to be a senior pastor someplace. How'd you like to be our associate pastor here? And I thought, maybe God is grabbing my face and asking me to look back at him. So after a prayer and consideration, we were convinced that what was happening. But it wasn't a supernatural thing. I didn't see lights. There was no fireworks. It was God gradually just turning my head in the midst of my same old, same old. Maybe God is doing the same thing for you. Let me encourage you. This is something I put into practice actually 10 years ago, and I do it almost every day now. I call it I Spy. What I do is anytime something strikes me, that I think it may be God speaking to me, that it's something unusual in the midst of the usual, I write it down or put it in a folder in my email box. And I review those on a weekly basis to see if I can see God's fingerprint. Is there something that God's trying to turn my head back toward him on? Let me encourage you to do that this week. Just start something called I Spy and watch what God may be saying to you. Because here's the deal. We may think that, man, we've dumped our Harleys, it's too late. My life will never change. But God is working, and he is speaking to you even now in that still small voice. He wants to gently grab your face and turn your gaze back to him. Any of y'all, I'm sure most of y'all have heard of Ravi Zacharias. Everybody know who Ravi is? He's one of my favorite guys. He's a Christian apologist, which means he defends the faith. And he's that odd combination of a really smart guy, intelligent guy, but he's also very gentle and loving. He addresses issues that some people would find very difficult to address in a kind way, and Ravi seems to find a way to do it. But Ravi wasn't always that way. So I don't know if you've heard his story, but he grew up in India. And so as a teenager, he looked around him. He started to look around him, and he saw just the terrible suffering and injustice in people's lives. And he also started to experience pain in his own life. He just could not see any meaning to life, and he really got despondent. And this was as a teenager. And so Ravi attempted to take his own life as a teenager. And so he was taken to the hospital, and as he was recovering there, they saved his life, obviously, but he still was struggling with these feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. And somebody gave him a Bible. Now remember, we're in India, and India is predominantly what? Hindu, so this is very unlikely. It's very unlikely. And Ravi says, well, I'm laying here, I might as well read it. And so he opens to this passage, John 14:19. It says, and this is what it says, because I live, you also will live. And those were the words of Jesus. And Ravi said that those words changed his life. In a predominantly Hindu country, a Bible just happens to show up. And a Bible just happens to be opened to John 14:19. And a young man who is suicidal just happens to read that passage. And that passage changes his life. God grabbed Ravi's face and turned it back to him. And of course, you know the rest of Ravi's story. He becomes an evangelist. He becomes an apologist. He has a huge ministry that reaches college campuses all over the world. Ravi, several years later, decided to go back to his hometown in India to visit the graves of his ancestors. And that's sort of a thing we do. I came from Gillespie, Illinois. Anybody know where Gillespie, Illinois is? I'd be surprised if you did. It's a little town, coal mining town. Whenever we go back, we always go back and visit the graves of my grandparents. That's just something you do. And so he went back to visit his grandmother's grave, hadn't been there in years. And of course, they needed help to find it because this place had become overgrown, as you would think it would in India. And they finally find her gravestone. They're starting to clean off the stone. The attendant cleans off the stone for them. And Ravi's wife reaches over and grabs his hand. And she says, "Do you see what's written on the gravestone?" It was John 14:19. "Because I live, you will also live." Have you dumped your spiritual Harley? Does life seem hopeless? Does it seem like God is not doing anything and you're stuck? God is active, and the King of the universe wants to, if he could, would grab your face and ask you to switch your gaze from what's going on around you onto him. In order to change the trajectory of our lives, we must change the direction of our gaze. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your grace in my life. I am so prone to look at what's going on around me and just make bad, stinking decisions. And after I've dumped my Harley, I wonder if I'll ever be able to ride again. Father, I pray for all of us that we would be able to see what you're doing, even in the midst of our worst mistakes and even in the midst of the most terrible decisions that we could make. You are still there. You are working on our behalf. And if we will turn our gaze back upon you, we can change the trajectory of our lives. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.